The story of medieval Europe is not a single tale, but a long and uneven journey. It begins in the echo of collapsing marble when the Roman Empire, once the heart of the world, crumbled into silence. Roads cracked, statues fell, empires dissolved into 1,000 frightened villages. For centuries the West would stumble through invasions, hunger, faith and fire, only to rise again, reshaped by the forces that sought to break it. This is the story of how Europe was born, not in triumph, but in ruins. A story of swords and prayers, of emperors and monks, of merchants, plagues and pilgrims. A story of how a fractured land became a force that would one day reach across the entire world. Close your eyes. The aqueducts are dry, the legions are gone. A crow circles above a forgotten forum. This is where our journey begins. The Roman world did not end with a thunderclap. It ended with a sigh. For centuries, Roman Empire had stood like a colossal marble statue, polished and gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. Its roads ran straight as arrows, its aqueducts fed cities that pulsed with light and laughter, and its legions patrolled borders that stretched across continents. It had lasted so long, so steadily, that its citizens had begun to believe it always would. But even the mightiest walls eventually crack. In the early centuries of the Common Era, Rome enjoyed what poets and politicians alike called Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Trade flowed easily across its seas, grain fed distant provinces, and theaters echoed with voices reciting lines older than memory. People could travel from the forests of Gaul to the deserts of Syria and remain under one rule, one law, one empire. But beneath the polished surface, the foundations were shifting. The empire had grown too vast, too heavy to carry its own weight. Political turmoil roiled the capital. In distant provinces, governors ruled like kings. The currency thinned, its silver clipped and diluted. Disease came like a whisper on the wind plagues that blackened the streets and emptied the markets. Famines followed. Armies began to falter, stretched too thin to hold the frontiers. It was not one single blow that undid Rome, but 1,000 small cuts. Then came the outsiders. To the north and east, beyond the forests and rivers, lived peoples the Romans called barbarians. They were no mindless hordes, as Roman chroniclers would later claim, but families, tribes, nations, many fleeing their own wars, others searching for fertile land, others simply drawn toward the wealth that shimmered behind Roman walls. They pushed against the frontiers like a rising tide, testing, probing, pressing. In 395 CE, Rome itself admitted what it could no longer deny. The empire was too big to govern as one. It was split into two. In the east, from the glittering city of Constantinople, Byzantine Empire would endure for another 1,000 years. But in the west, centered around Rome, the empire was old, frail, and tired. Once proud legions became local militias. Taxes went unpaid, aqueducts cracked. The Rhine and Danube rivers, the old frontiers no longer held. Germanic peoples crossed in growing numbers. At first, they were allowed to settle as guests, farmers on imperial land in exchange for service. But as imperial authority thinned, these guests became rulers. One by one, Roman territories began to slip away, not with explosions or heroic last stands, but with the quiet reshuffling of power. In the year 476, the inevitable happened. A warlord named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus. A child king, barely more than a puppet, was swept aside without a grand battle. The Senate sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, as if admitting the West no longer ruled itself. The Western Roman Empire was gone. Imagine the sound of that moment. No cannon, no clash of shields, just the wind through the forum, the drip of water from broken fountains, the distant cry of a raven over the ruins. For a Roman citizen living through it, the world must have felt as if it were dissolving around them. Markets, once crowded, now stood silent. Statues lay toppled, their faces eroded. Roads that once carried legions now carried refugees. Later generations would call the centuries that followed the Dark Ages. But darkness is never truly the end, it is the hour before something new is born. The fall of Rome did not destroy Europe, it cleared the stage, and on that quiet, broken stage, new kingdoms, new cultures, and new faiths would soon rise. When the last Roman emperor was deposed, the world did not suddenly turn to chaos. It shifted slowly, unevenly, like the settling of a great stone after it cracks. In the western provinces, old Roman titles faded into whispers, but the lands themselves remained. Towns emptied, fields grew wild, and over the bones of the empire, new rulers emerged. These rulers were the so-called barbarians, though they had lived on Rome's frontiers for centuries. They were not faceless marauders, but organized peoples. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, the Visigothic kingdom in Hispania, and the Frankish kingdom in Gaul. They carved out territories like shards of a fallen statue, each piece still carrying traces of Roman shape and memory. Their warlords called themselves kings, wore Roman cloaks, and struck coins with Latin inscriptions. In time, they would not simply live among the ruins, they would inherit them. But the empire they inherited was already fading. The bustling cities that once anchored Roman life, Milan, Trier, Lyon, had begun to wither long before the empire fell. Their streets, once paved and swept, cracked beneath weeds. Amphitheaters stood hollow and roofless, their marble stolen for barns and churches. With no legions to protect them and no central authority to sustain them, urban life collapsed into small pockets of survival. Trade, once the lifeblood of Rome, slowed to a trickle. The great roads were still there, cutting across the landscape like ghost veins, but merchants no longer filled them. Without security, caravans stopped coming. Without caravans, markets died, and without markets, cities crumbled. Literacy followed. In Roman times, scribes, merchants, bureaucrats, and priests filled libraries with contracts, chronicles, and poetry. Now, ink dried in abandoned offices. Scrolls were left to rot in the damp. Knowledge became the guarded treasure of a few scattered monasteries, where monks scratched Latin letters onto parchment, while outside, the countryside grew quieter each year. Power became local. A king's authority extended only as far as his riders could reach before sunset. The Franks ruled Gaul, but beyond the nearest hill, a local noble might obey or not. A Visigothic king might wear a crown, but a bad harvest could topple him faster than an invading army. Amid this fragmentation, faith endured. Christianity, born in the eastern provinces centuries earlier, had already become the empire's official religion. Now it spread through the new kingdoms like ivy on broken stone. Barbarian elites adopted it to secure legitimacy, blending Roman symbols with their own tribal customs. A Visigoth might still wear a wolf's pelt, but he was baptized beneath a cross. A Frankish warrior might still swear loyalty by the sword, but he'd do it before an altar. To live in this world was to walk among echoes. Imagine standing at dawn on a crumbling Roman bridge moss, creeping over its stones, the river whispering beneath. In the distance, smoke rises from a wooden village. not a city. A traveler crosses with a donkey, carrying grain instead of silk. The old empire is gone, but its bones remain not just in stones, but in law, language, and memory. For the people who lived here, this was not the end of civilization. It was simply a smaller one, a world turned inward, villages instead of empires, lords instead of emperors, a whispered Latin prayer where once there had been thunderous Roman law. The world was quiet now, but not still. In that quiet, the shape of medieval Europe was slowly forming. As the Western Roman world lay fragmented, the eastern half endured. From the shining marble domes of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire stood like a lone, defiant torch against the growing darkness. Its streets still bustled with merchants speaking Greek, Latin, Persian, and Arabic. Its libraries still held the knowledge of philosophers. Its soldiers still marched in disciplined ranks beneath the double-headed eagle. In the 6th century, one man believed that torch could rekindle the West. Justinian the ambitious, relentless, dreamed of restoring Rome's former glory. His armies swept across the Mediterranean, clawing back pieces of the old empire. North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogothic kingdom. For a moment, it seemed the dream might live again. But the dream was built on exhausted gold, a devastating plague, empty treasuries, and the endless weight of war dragged his empire down. As soon as the Byzantines took Italy, the Lombards descended, claiming it like wolves on wounded prey. The West remained fractured. Justinian's empire remained powerful, but it was an Eastern empire now, and just as the Byzantines struggled to hold their conquests, a new force was stirring far to the south. In the 7th century, on the arid plains of Arabia, a new faith and a new civilization rose with breathtaking speed. Rashidun Caliphate, followed swiftly by the Umayyad Caliphate, exploded outward like a storm. The armies of Islam, driven by faith and forged in the desert, swept across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain in less than a century. Ancient provinces that once belonged to Rome, Syria, Egypt, Carthage fell like autumn leaves in a wind. This was not just a conquest of land. It was a reordering of the world. Where there had once been one Mediterranean civilization, now there were three. To the east, Byzantine, heir to Rome's legacy, sophisticated and old. To the south, the Islamic Caliphate, young, dynamic, and expanding with astonishing speed. And to the west, the fractured kingdoms of medieval Europe, weak, rural, and afraid. For a time, it seemed as if the West might be swallowed whole. In 711, Muslim forces crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, toppling the Visigothic kingdom in Hispania with shocking ease. From there, their cavalry thundered northward, through mountain passes and into Gaul. Local kings and lords scrambled to hold their ground. Europe trembled. But in 732, on a cold autumn morning near the town of Tours, the tide met its first resistance. Frankish warriors under Charles Martel. The hammer stood their ground against the advancing Muslim army. Swords clashed in the mist, and by nightfall the Franks had won. It was not the end of the Caliphate's power in Europe, but it was the end of its expansion into Gaul. In later centuries, the battle would be remembered as a turning point. The moment a fragile, fractured Europe proved it could still fight back. But the truth was more complicated. This was not a clean clash of civilizations, but a tangle of cultures, faiths, and ambitions. In Spain, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in blood. In Sicily, Arab traders built cities where once there had been ruins. In the east, Byzantine diplomats negotiated, fought, and borrowed from their rivals. It was a world not of walls, but of shifting lines. Faith was no longer just a private matter, it was the great dividing line of the age. The cross in the west, the crescent in the south, the cross and crown of Byzantium in the east. 3 worlds, 3 visions of power and order, staring at each other across the blue Mediterranean. In the small Frankish kingdoms of the north, that knowledge burned like a spark. The west could no longer remain a cluster of petty kingdoms. It needed strength, it needed unity, and soon, from the heart of Francia, that spark would ignite. After the Battle of Tours, the fragile kingdoms of the West began to understand something Rome had once known well. Survival required power, and power required unity. The Frankish realm, a patchwork of warrior lords and farmland kingdoms, would be the first to take that lesson seriously. The story began with Charles Martel, the Hammer. He was no king, but a power behind the throne, a man who had proven that disciplined Frankish warriors could stand against the seemingly unstoppable cavalry of the Umayyad Caliphate. His victory became a symbol not just of defense, but of what the Franks could be. His sons inherited not only his lands, but also his ambition. His son, Pepin the Short, made a bold move. The Merovingian kings who nominally ruled the Franks had long been figureheads, their authority little more than ceremony. Pepin, with quiet calculation, asked the one institution powerful enough to legitimize a coup: the Church. In return for protecting the Pope from his enemies, particularly the Lombards in Italy, Pepin received what no Frankish warlord before him had held: the crown of a king. It was not taken by force, but placed upon his head by holy hands. And with that gesture, an alliance was forged between sword and cross, throne and altar. This bond between the Frankish rulers and the Catholic Church would reshape Europe. When Pepin died, his son inherited more than just a kingdom. Charlemagne. Charles the Great inherited a mission. Tall, broad-shouldered, restless, he was the kind of man legends cling to. From the moment he took the throne in 768, he moved like a storm across the map of Europe. For more than 40 years, Charlemagne waged war. He marched his armies through the forests of Saxony, where pagan tribes still clung to their old gods, over the Alps into Italy, where the Lombards threatened Rome, and deep into the plains of Central Europe. His campaigns were relentless, brutal at times, but they expanded Frankish rule farther than anyone thought possible. By the end of his reign, he held sway over most of Western Christendom, Francia, much of Germany, northern Italy, parts of Spain. But Charlemagne did not merely conquer, he built. He reimagined kingship not as a loose chain of lords, but as something stronger, an empire. He established royal courts, sent envoys to govern distant lands, and tried to bring some order to the chaos of the post-Roman world. He revived Roman legal traditions, encouraged the use of Latin, and protected monasteries as centers of learning. In an age of crumbling literacy, he ordered the preservation of texts, the copying of manuscripts, the teaching of grammar and scripture. Monks in quiet scriptoria became the keepers of civilization. And then, one winter night in 800 CE, everything changed. Charlemagne entered St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. As he knelt in prayer, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. More than 3 centuries after the last emperor had fallen in the West, the title was reborn. The crowd shouted, Carolus Augustus. Bells rang out across Rome. Of course, the reality was more fragile than the ceremony suggested. Charlemagne's empire was not Rome. It was held together by personal loyalty, fragile alliances, and the weight of his own personality. Yet that night, beneath the candles of St. Peter's, something powerful took root, the idea of a Christian empire in the West. A Europe united not by Roman legions, but by faith, culture, and the dream of order. This moment lit a brief but brilliant flame. Under Charlemagne's rule, learning flickered back to life. Scholars from across the continent gathered at his court in Aachen, where a new intellectual movement, the Carolingian Renaissance, began to stitch together, the scraps of the classical world and the medieval one being born. Monks wrote, teachers taught, builders carved stone cathedrals where pagan shrines had once stood. For the first time in centuries, the West felt like it was breathing again. A sense of purpose returned to a land that had been drifting. And yet, as history would soon remind everyone, even the brightest flames can cast long shadows. For a brief, golden moment, Charlemagne's empire seemed solid, a single Christian realm rising from the ruins of Rome. But the strength of that empire lived in one man's hands. When Charlemagne died in 814, the light did not go out immediately, but it began to flicker. His sons struggled to hold together what his father had forged. His grandsons turned on one another, and Europe began to fracture once again. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun divided the Carolingian Empire into 3 parts: West Francia, East Francia, and a narrow middle kingdom. On parchment, the borders were drawn with neat lines, but on the ground, those lines meant weakness. With each division came rivalries, with each rivalry came war, and with war came opportunity for those waiting beyond the frontiers. From the north came the Vikings. They arrived not as armies at first, but as swift shadows on long ships, slicing silently through fog-bound rivers. Their ships could skim over shallow water, slipping into the very heart of the Carolingian lands. Villages that had once slept in peace awoke to horns, fire, and steel. Monasteries rich, unwalled, filled with gold chalices and illuminated manuscripts became their favored prey. The monks wrote of the sky darkening with sails. From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. From the east rode the Magyars, skilled horsemen sweeping across the plains of Central Europe. They struck like lightning, raiding settlements and disappearing before kings could rally their armies. To the south, Muslim raiders launched attacks from bases in the Mediterranean, burning towns and seizing captives along the coasts of Italy, southern France. 3 storms converged on a divided empire. The Carolingian kings were powerless to stop them. Their armies were slow, fragmented, and scattered across fiefdoms where local lords commanded more loyalty than any distant crown. So the people turned for protection, not to kings, but to those who could actually defend them, local nobles, with their own armed retainers and wooden castles rising like jagged teeth from hilltops. It was here, in this crucible of fear and fragmentation, that the world of feudalism was born. The wooden Motte Bailey castles that began dotting the countryside were not just homes, they were fortresses, symbols of survival. From these strongholds, lords offered protection to peasants in exchange for loyalty, labor, and a portion of their harvest. The bond was personal, sealed not by law, but by oath. A noble would grant land a fief to a vassal, who would swear to fight in return. These webs of loyalty grew tangled and overlapping, forming a landscape where a peasant might owe obedience to one lord, that lord to another, and that other lord to a distant, weakened king. Warfare itself was changing too. In Roman times, infantry had carried the weight of empire. But now, new military innovations, like the stirrup, gave mounted warriors a decisive edge. Cavalry charges became the sledgehammer of medieval battle, and only the wealthy could afford the armor, horses, and training required. Power shifted upward, away from common soldiers toward a warrior nobility. Imagine it, a Viking longship gliding silently into a river valley at dawn, bells ringing from a monastery tower, a handful of peasants running to the local lord's keep, clutching their children and sacks of grain. Above them, the dark shape of a wooden tower looms against the sky. In that moment, the king in a distant city is meaningless. Only the lord on the hill matters. By the end of the 10th century, the Carolingian world had splintered into 1,000 local powers. Kings wore crowns, but their authority was paper-thin. Nobles ruled their lands like small monarchs, their strength drawn from personal armies, not national institutions. This web of oaths, land, and military service would shape European society for centuries to come. The dream of a united Christian empire faded into memory, replaced by a patchwork of fortified valleys, wooden castles, and shifting loyalties. And yet, while the sword had shattered Europe into fragments, history was already preparing a quiet turn. The invasions would end, the land would grow, and out of these fragments, a new kind of Europe would take shape. When died in 814, his dream of a unified Christian empire began to fray almost immediately. His sons quarreled, his grandsons went to war, and the empire split into pieces like a shattered crown. In 843, they carved the Carolingian world into 3 parts, West Francia, East Francia, and a narrow middle strip that would soon vanish altogether. On maps, it looked orderly. On the ground, it was chaos. Borders shifted, alliances broke, and as the rulers argued, the world beyond their frontiers was watching and moving. From the north came the fierce seafarers from Scandinavia, whose longships could glide through oceans and rivers alike. Their sails, striped red and white, appeared like thunderclouds on the horizon. They came for silver, for cattle, for slaves, for glory. They burned monasteries, those fragile islands of literacy, and carried away the treasures of saints. Chroniclers wrote their prayers in panic. A furor Normanorum libera nos, Domine from the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord. From the east rode the Ratrane, swift horsemen from the Eurasian plains. They struck hard and disappeared faster than news of their raids could travel. To the south, Muslim pirates and raiders, the Saracens as they were called, launched lightning attacks along the Mediterranean coast, even reaching the gates of Rome itself. Every direction brought danger. Every horizon held fire. And through it all, the kings of Europe were powerless. Their armies were small, their commands ignored. Peasants no longer looked to distant monarchs for help. They turned to those who could protect them, local warlords who built fortresses on the nearest hill and promised safety in exchange for service. These men became lords, and their wooden keeps became the heart of medieval life. This was the birth of not a law, not an invention, but a desperate adaptation. When central authority collapsed, people clung to personal bonds. A noble granted land a fief to a vassal who swore an oath of loyalty in return. Peasants, bound to the soil, worked that land in exchange for the lord's protection. Power became local, personal, and perpetual. Picture the landscape. Rivers winding through empty valleys, small villages clustered around a wooden tower, smoke rising from thatched roofs, the sound of a blacksmith's hammer echoing off distant hills. On the hill above, a Motte and Bailey castle, crude by later standards, but formidable, then loomed over its domain. Inside, the lord dined beside his hearth, his sword within reach, his men-at-arms sleeping by the gate. Beyond those walls, the world was a patchwork of loyalties and fear. A peasant owed labor to his lord, the lord owed soldiers to his overlord, and the overlord swore fealty to a king who, in truth, could command little more than his own household. Kingship became symbolic. Real power belonged to whoever could hold a fortress and defend it. New tools of war entrenched this order. The stirrup, a simple loop of metal and leather, changed everything. It gave mounted warriors balance and force, allowing them to strike with terrifying precision. The armored knight became the engine of medieval battle, and only the wealthy could afford it. Thus, the nobility became not only the ruling class, but the fighting one. Europe turned inward. Each valley, each castle, each parish became a world unto itself. Trade dwindled, cities shrank, and even language fractured. The dream of empire was gone. What remained was 1,000 little sovereignties, each guarded by walls and oaths. And yet out of this chaos, something new was taking shape. The invasions would not last forever. The storms would calm. Fields would grow fertile again, and kings would begin to rise once more. The age of despair was ending, and the soil was quietly preparing for rebirth. The 10th century opened with a Europe in pieces, a land of broken empires, hungry warlords, and frightened villages. But history, like the seasons, has its turns. The same Europe that had been carved apart by invasion was now beginning to breathe again. The great raids that had terrorized the West began to falter. The Vikings, once the scourge of monasteries and coastal towns, started to settle. They farmed the lands they once burned, married local women, converted to Christianity, and became part of the kingdoms they had once raided. In northern Francia, a group of these Norse settlers swore loyalty to the Frankish king, taking root as the Duchy of Normandy. The hammer had become the plough. To the east, the Magyars were defeated in the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 by Otto III, king of the Germans. Their raids ceased, and they, too, would eventually settle, founding their own Christian kingdom in the Carpathian Basin. The Muslim raiders who had once terrorized the coasts faced growing resistance. The storm that had defined the previous centuries finally began to clear. But it wasn't just war that was changing. Nature itself seemed to lean toward calm. The climate warmed subtly, steadily ushering in what historians now call the medieval warm period. Winters grew less brutal. Harvests became more reliable. Across the continent, fields expanded, forests were cleared, and new villages rose from the earth like spring shoots after a hard frost. Peasants began to produce more than they needed to survive, and that simple fact transformed everything. More food meant more people. More people meant new markets, and new markets meant the slow, steady return of trade. Old Roman roads that had been abandoned now saw carts rumbling once again. Rivers carried barges heavy with wool, grain, and salt. The land itself seemed to be exhaling after centuries of holding its breath. Amid this change, rulers emerged from the shadows of their lords. In England, Alfred the Great and his successors unified the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, forging the Kingdom of England for the first time. In the east, Otto the Great turned East Francia into something more than a fractured realm. His victory over the Magyars and his alliances with the Church culminated in a grand moment. In 962, he was crowned emperor. From his hands rose the Holy Roman Empire, a new imperial dream, German in power, but Roman in spirit. Cities long shrunken, half forgotten, began to stir again. In the early 11th century, they were still small compared to the bustling metropolises of the Islamic world or Byzantium. But their revival was unmistakable. Market squares filled with chatter, blacksmiths hammered, and church bells marked the rhythm of daily life. Stone replaced timber, walls rose higher, hope returned. Picture a morning in the year 1000. A farmer walking to the village with sacks of grain, the mist clinging to the fields. A merchant's cart creaking along an old Roman road, its wheels catching the sunlight. In the distance, the spire of a church rises over a cluster of homes. For the first time in generations, the landscape is not defined by smoke and raids, but by work, growth, and faith. Europe was not unified, far from it. Power still belonged to a web of kings, lords, bishops, and abbots. But the endless sense of siege was fading, and in its place came something far more dangerous and exhilarating: ambition. This was the moment when Europe turned from merely surviving to expanding. Its eyes, once fixed inward, began to look outward again toward the horizon, toward conquest, toward faith and empire. The tide had shifted. By the dawn of the 11th century, Europe was no longer merely holding its breath. It was moving again, growing, reaching, and imagining itself as something greater. Fields stretched farther, trade routes wove themselves back together, cities stirred awake, and kingdoms began to flex their power beyond their old, crumbling borders. The patchwork of wooden fortresses and quiet valleys was slowly transforming into something far more ambitious. The warriors who once defended their own hills now dreamed of conquering others. In the north of France, descendants of Viking settlers of the Duchy of Normandy had transformed from raiders into a disciplined, fiercely ambitious power. In 1066, their duke, William the Conqueror, crossed the English Channel with an army of knights, archers, and priests carrying holy banners. On a windswept field near Hastings, the Anglo-Saxon shield wall broke. William's cavalry crushed the English forces, and the Norman conquest of England began. With it, England changed overnight. Its language, its nobility, its architecture, even the way it was ruled, were reshaped under Norman hands. Castles rose where wooden halls once stood. Latin law entwined with Anglo-Saxon tradition. England became a fortress kingdom, ruled from stone towers. But the Normans were not content with England alone. They rode south as well to Sicily and southern Italy, lands rich and contested between Byzantine Empire and Fatimid Caliphate. There they carved out their own states with fire and sword, blending northern ferocity with Mediterranean wealth. Within a single lifetime, a people who had once arrived as pagan raiders had become the rulers of three great realms: Normandy, England, and Sicily. Meanwhile, to the southwest, another long war simmered. In the Iberian Peninsula, Christian kingdoms in the north pressed slowly southward against Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus. This struggle, called the Reconquista, was as much a war of faith as of land. Monks and knights marched together. Frontier castles rose like scars across mountain passes. For some, it was war. For others, a mission. And then came a call that echoed across Christendom. In 1095, standing before a gathering of nobles in Clermont, Pope Urban II raised his voice and urged Christian warriors to march east to liberate Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. The response was electric. Lords pledged their swords. Peasants joined in masses. A tide of men and women began to move, not for plunder alone, but for salvation, glory, and absolution. Thus began the First Crusade. The roads of Europe filled with pilgrims and soldiers, some armored and mounted, others barefoot and hungry. They crossed rivers, mountains, and the ruins of old empires. They sang hymns as they marched toward an idea, as much as a place Jerusalem, the heart of three faiths. After years of brutal struggle, they seized the city in 1099, establishing fragile crusader states along the eastern Mediterranean coast. It was a triumph painted in both banners and blood. This was Europe's first great outward surge since Rome, and it was about more than religion. Crusaders brought home spices, silks, medical knowledge, mathematics, stories, and ideas that had flourished in the Islamic world and Byzantium. Merchants in Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa grew rich ferrying crusaders and their spoils. Cultural contact, however violent, became exchange. Europe was no longer a quiet backwater on the edge of the old world, it was pushing itself into it. Imagine standing on a hill in northern France as the first crusading armies gather. The air is thick with the sound of iron-shod hooves. Banners ripple, priests raise their voices in blessing, men kiss their children goodbye. They do not know what they will find beyond the sea, only that they are part of something larger than themselves. In this age of expansion, faith and power marched hand in hand. Europe had begun to look outward, and the world would never look the same again. In the centuries after the First Crusade, a single institution rose to a height of power it had never before known: the Catholic Church. When kings were weak and nobles quarreled, the Church was everywhere, in every village, over every grave, beside every hearth. It spoke in one language, Latin, when Europe spoke in 100. It crowned kings, excommunicated emperors, and moved armies not with swords, but with words. The Church had not always been so mighty. In the early Middle Ages, priests were local, often tied to noble families, their authority limited to their lands. But in the 10th and 11th centuries, a movement began to transform it from a loose network into a centralized power: the Gregorian Reform, named after Pope Gregory VII. This reform sought to free the Church from the world. It was not enough for bishops to pray, they had to be independent. Nobles had long treated churches as their private property, appointing priests and bishops like one might grant land. Gregory and his allies set out to break that pattern, to wrest power away from kings and lords and give it to the Pope. The struggle came to a head in one of the most famous confrontations in medieval history. In the winter of 1077, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV traveled across the Alps, barefoot, through snow and ice, to a castle in Canossa. Outside the gate, shivering, he waited for 3 days, begging the Pope to lift his excommunication. It was a moment heavy with symbolism, the most powerful monarch in Europe humbling himself before a Pope. The walk to Canossa became a legend. Though the conflict would flare again and Henry would eventually seize Rome and install his own Pope, the tide had turned. Over the next century, the papacy built a new kind of power, centralized, disciplined, and far-reaching. Popes commanded armies of bishops and abbots who answered not to local lords, but to Rome. Canon law, the Church's own legal system, rivaled royal law. Its wealth grew vast through tithes, lands, and pilgrimages. At its head sat a pope who ruled not just a religion, but an empire of faith. The Church became a kingdom with no borders. A king might rule England or France, but the Pope ruled souls. In daily life, its presence was absolute. Every birth was blessed at a font, every marriage bound at an altar, every death marked by bells. If a noble defied the Church, he could be excommunicated, cut off from the sacraments, treated as an outcast, denied burial. Entire kingdoms could be placed under interdict, silencing church bells, halting marriages, forbidding funerals. For medieval people who believed salvation lay through the Church, that was no mere political punishment. It was a threat to their eternity. This immense power also brought grandeur. Cathedrals soared over towns like mountains of stone and glass. Monks in cloisters illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf. Pilgrims walked for months to reach holy sites. The Church became the great storyteller of the age, the keeper of knowledge, the guardian of morality, the architect of meaning. And yet, beneath this splendor, a tension simmered. Kings and nobles watched uneasily as popes claimed powers once reserved for monarchs. The line between throne and altar blurred and shifted with every generation. But for now, in the High Middle Ages, it was the Church that towered over all. Imagine standing in the nave of Chartres Cathedral around 1150. Sunlight filters through stained glass windows, casting the floor in ruby and sapphire light. A choir sings in Latin, their voices echoing like something unearthly. A peasant kneels beside a nobleman, both tiny beneath the vaulted ceiling. Above them, the Church watches not just as faith, but as power. Europe was no longer a land of forgotten kingdoms. It was a land bound together not by a king, but by a cross. For centuries, the Catholic Church and Europe's feudal order seemed immovable like ancient oaks rooted deep in the soil. Kings ruled their realms, popes commanded souls, and lords ruled their valleys behind thick stone walls. Cathedrals rose, fields flourished, trade expanded. It felt, for a time, like the medieval world had finally found its rhythm. But beneath that still surface, fault lines were growing. Around the year 1300, the climate shifted once again. The warmth that had filled the air for centuries gave way to cold, wet years. Harvests failed, rivers froze earlier, storms came harder. Famines swept through the countryside, hollowing out villages. Starvation tore through people who had known nothing but steady growth for generations. The age of easy plenty was ending, and then, just when the land was at its weakest, something far more terrible arrived. In 1347, a handful of merchant ships sailed into ports along the Mediterranean. They carried not just goods, but death. A plague, bubonic plague, had swept from the steppes of Central Asia through trade routes, devouring populations as it went. In Europe, it would become known simply as the Black Death. Within months, it reached cities and villages alike, spreading faster than anyone could comprehend. It is difficult even now to imagine the scale. Towns fell silent, streets emptied, bells tolled constantly for the dead, corpses piled faster than they could be buried. Chroniclers wrote of people abandoning their families out of terror. Whole villages vanished. Priests walked from house to house, giving last rites until they too fell sick. No one was spared, not kings, not monks, not peasants. By the time the plague's first great wave had passed, an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population was gone. In some places, it was half. But the Black Death did more than kill. It shattered the world people thought they lived in. The church, once the unshakable pillar of hope, faltered. Its priests died alongside its flock. Its prayers failed to stop the pestilence. Its authority, for the first time in centuries, was questioned. How could an institution that claimed to hold the keys to salvation be so powerless before this invisible enemy? Feudalism, too, cracked. With so many dead, fields lay empty. Lords found themselves without laborers. Peasants, suddenly scarce and desperately needed, began to bargain for better terms. Some walked away from their manors entirely, seeking better lives elsewhere. Wages rose, old hierarchies bent under the weight of demographic collapse. Not all lords accepted this new reality. In England, France, and the Low Countries, brutal attempts were made to chain peasants back to the soil. This sparked uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, brief, fiery, and often crushed, but unforgettable. Even when revolts failed, the idea remained. The old order could be challenged, and in the cities, something else stirred. With fewer mouths to feed, those who survived often inherited land, tools, and wealth. Urban centers grew wealthier and more assertive. Guilds of merchants and craftsmen, once humble, became powerful. Literacy spread. So did the appetite for knowledge, for innovation, for questioning. Even in the darkness of plague years, invention took root. Watermills and windmills turned. New techniques in metalworking emerged. Eyeglasses, clocks, and eventually movable type would follow. In Italy, especially in cities like Florence, a new cultural heartbeat began to stir. It was quiet at first, barely more than a whisper, but it would grow into something that would reshape the world, the Renaissance. Imagine a deserted village in the winter of 1348. A church door swings open in the wind. Snow settles on an empty cart. A single candle burns in a window. And yet, in a city hundreds of miles away, a young apprentice sharpens his quill and sketches something new. Out of catastrophe, a different world is forming. The Black Death did not simply kill, it rearranged the bones of medieval Europe. When the Black Death receded, it left behind a Europe transformed. The continent had endured something almost unimaginable and survived. Entire communities had vanished, but for those who remained, the world suddenly looked different. Power had shifted. Hierarchies had cracked. Possibility hung in the air like the hush before a storm. The great feudal web that had once tied peasant to lord and lord to king no longer held with the same iron grip. In the fields, laborers were fewer and more valuable. They bargained for higher wages, better terms, or walked away altogether. Some became free farmers, others found work in growing towns. Across the countryside, landlords reluctantly adapted or faded into ruin. In the cities, a new class began to rise: merchants, artisans, bankers. Guilds tightened their control over trades. Wealth accumulated in bustling urban centers like Florence, Venice, and Bruges. And with wealth came confidence. Commerce flourished along Mediterranean routes. Ships carried spices, silk, glass, books, and ideas. Markets grew louder. City halls rose higher. The age of castles and plows was slowly giving way to one of counting houses and voyages. Technology sharpened the blade of change. Gunpowder, introduced to Europe from Asia, changed the very language of war. Cannons reduced once impregnable castles to rubble. Crossbow bolts and early firearms could bring down armored knights who once ruled the battlefield. The knight, symbol of feudal power, was no longer invincible. Power shifted upward to kings who could afford these new armies, and downward to professional soldiers no longer bound to noble birth. At the same time, a quiet revolution of the mind was underway. In the cities of Italy, scholars and artists turned their gaze not only upward, toward heaven, but backward toward the texts of Roman Empire and Byzantine Empire, toward ancient Greece, toward the human mind itself. They called it Rinascita, rebirth. The Italian Renaissance had begun. Painters studied anatomy, light and perspective. Philosophers debated reason and faith. Merchants funded scholars who translated lost texts and built libraries. Europe was rediscovering not only knowledge, but the idea that the world could be remade. But this intellectual flowering did not emerge in isolation. It was the child of centuries of trade, conquest, and survival. Ideas flowed along the same routes as silks and spices. Contact with the Islamic world during the Crusades, trade with Byzantium, translations of Arabic and Greek texts, all these currents converged, like rivers meeting the sea, into the Renaissance. Meanwhile, kings moved to claim their place atop the new order. The 100 Years' War between England and France reshaped both kingdoms. In France, the rise of Joan of Arc became legend, a peasant girl who defied every expectation, leading armies and inspiring a fractured nation. By the war's end, France emerged stronger, its monarchy more centralized. England, too, transformed, shedding its old feudal skin. In Iberia, two royal houses united in marriage, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella III of Castile, forming the backbone of a new Spain. Their armies conquered Granada in 1492, ending nearly 800 years of Muslim rule on the peninsula. The Reconquista was complete, and Spain was reborn as a centralized Christian power. This was not just the closing chapter of the medieval world. It was the prologue to something far larger. That same year, far to the west, Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic under the Spanish crown, reaching lands unknown to Europeans. The age of discovery had begun. Soon, Portuguese ships would circle Africa's southern tip, Spanish fleets would cross oceans, and Europe, once a battered, fragmented land huddled around its own troubles, would stretch its hands across the globe. Imagine standing on a dock in 1492. The masts of a caravel sway against a dawn sky. Men load barrels of salted meat, rope, and maps inked with guesses. The wind smells of salt and new worlds. For 1,000 years, Europe had looked inward, defending itself, rebuilding itself, dreaming in quiet. But now, its gaze was fixed on the horizon. The medieval world had ended not with a single event, but with a long exhale. A continent born in the ashes of Rome had grown, broken, suffered, rebuilt, and finally risen. What followed would shape the modern world. By the year 1500, Europe had become something its ancestors could scarcely have imagined. The world that rose from Rome's ashes had endured invasions, rebuilt itself through faith and steel, and then stretched outward with sails and gunpowder. The Italian Renaissance burned like a new sun, while kingdoms grew into nations and merchants carried the world in their ships. The Middle Ages did not end in a single night. They ended in a long, slow awakening. A continent once isolated was now preparing to shape the globe. The marble of Rome had fallen, but from its dust, cathedrals rose, empires shattered, kingdoms emerged, and from the edges of old maps, ships set sail toward new worlds. This is not the end of the story. It is only the moment when history turned its gaze outward and everything changed.